Well, good morning, everyone. This is Thursday, the 11th of June, and we remain, of course, in lockdown. So whatever information we have will be placed on our church website at St Michael's, Flixton, and will be downloaded into Facebook and YouTube as well, I think. But today, the 11th of June, the church celebrates the day of Thanksgiving for Holy Communion, Corpus Christi. So I just thought I'd like to put on record just some thoughts that you might be interested to hear on this subject of Corpus Christi. And in our Gospel reading today, taken from John chapter 6, verses 51 to 58, we hear these words. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them. That's verse 56. And of course, we use consecrated bread and wine, don't we, to represent his flesh and his blood in all Holy Communion services throughout the world. And it's a wonderful thing that we can celebrate throughout the world in this way. Now, a few years ago, when my mother was alive, she and my stepfather bought a bread making machine, and she was celiac, so she was allergic to wheat and needed to have bread made with alternatives to the traditional wheat that we use, and the rest of us obviously take for granted sometimes. So here we were, as a family, looking forward to that wonderful taste of and smell of freshly baked bread. Well, to start with, they did get that wonderful smell of freshly baked bread, but the taste was something that eluded them. And to put it mildly, the talk for the next month or so was all we would hear about bread making and what went wrong and what could be done about it. They tried changing the yeast, didn't make any difference. They tried changing the time that it was on. They tried adding different ingredients, altering the amount of sugar and salt and fat, all to no avail. And after these many discussions, they came across other people that had the same sort of problems, and various tips and well-tried recipes were swapped, and the solution, thankfully, was eventually found. I say thankfully because I just about lost the will to live after a month or so of this. The substitution, which worked, was changing the brand of flour for another one, and that's all it mattered. A little bit more or less of water as well, but that's all it was. It's good, isn't it? Sermons like this on Zoom, talking about bread making and all the tips and things. I mean, where else could you get all this information without signing up to a web page full of cookies that you got to accept? And it's not the cookies that I particularly enjoy eating, of course. It's those other kind of cookies found on every web page you go onto. Anyway, that's an aside, of course. Anyway, after they did start waking up to the smell and taste of freshly made bread, these wonderful crusty loaves, and oh, how we marvelled at such a small change of one ingredient could be so important, so vital, and make such a difference. Now, I mean, Jesus uses bread, doesn't he? As a symbol of daily life, yeah? Very simple, basic thing, but a vital commodity to make his point as well. He describes himself as the living bread, bread that came down from heaven. And he emphasizes that whoever eats this bread would gain eternal life. Now, his listeners at the time perhaps not surprisingly, challenged this, giving Jesus a chance to reiterate that he is talking about spiritual food and about eternal life beyond the frontier of normal death. It is the eternal life of Jesus within those who believe which holds out the promise of life forever. What was this bread from heaven Jesus was talking about, that he would enable them to live forever? If this was not sufficiently challenging to the people that listened, Jesus' listeners were thrown also by his talk of those who eat my flesh. Wow, he couldn't possibly be talking about cannibalism, could he? Well, of course not. And as for drinking blood, did he not know the strict Jewish food rules and rituals concerning such a thing? Well, of course he did. He was Jewish after all. You see, Jesus is most certainly not advocating cannibalism and the eating of his actual flesh, but is inviting his listeners, both then and today, to feed on his humanity. Fill your heart, your mind, your soul, your very inner being with me. That's what he's saying. This is his simple addition to the original recipe, you see, to make it work. Try to imagine yourself surrounded by well-stocked bookcases. Look on any Zoom meeting and see what's behind the speakers. I guarantee that 99% of them will have a bookcase full of books, neatly arranged, with the ones that they'd perhaps written to be seen over the right-hand shoulder of the listener. I haven't got any books that I have written, and none that I would like to show you either. Try to imagine yourself surrounded by a well-stocked bookcase. Much knowledge is available to you in those books, but as long as they remain on the shelves, unread, all this array of knowledge is, of course, useless. But when you take a book down from the shelves and open it and read it, it becomes part of you, doesn't it? It fills your mind or your imagination, or some parts of you might be fired up as well, and your heart's full, and others lift your spirits as well. And in our reenactment of Jesus' command at the communion table, we eat consecrated bread and drink consecrated wine, representing the body of Jesus and his blood that he spilled for us. That bread remains bread, and the wine remains wine. But by consuming it in faith, we take Jesus' body and blood, his humanity and his divinity into ourselves, into our very being. He becomes part of us, you see, as we become part of him at that time. A small piece of bread and the merest sip of wine, simple, natural, everyday things, and yet so important, so vital, and they make a big difference to us as Christians. And as in my mother's bread making machine, after trying different alternatives, let's try the simple change to the recipe and add Jesus to our everyday lives, not just on Sundays, but to walk with us every day and see if that magical combination of ingredients transforms our own well-being. Jesus said, fill your heart, your mind, your soul, your very being with me.